Welcome to part 2 of making a short documentary. Today I'm giving an overview of how I organize the edit, approach story structure, and also think in terms of thematic and visual movements to keep the film engaging. So if you're new to the channel, my name is Jakob Pander. I'm a filmmaker based in Portland, Oregon. I'm just getting the channel off the ground, so if you dig this video, please give it a like and subscribe to the channel. It helps out immensely. So back in the summer of 2020, I knew my dad had been planning to create a series of paintings around the local BLM protests.
The light on that thing is just amazing.
I had just picked up the iPhone 11 and I was actually experimenting with B-Script's anamorphic lenses and also their camera cages. So with those tools in hand, I began documenting my dad's process. I've got footage that I shot at the protests with my iPhone 11, the master interview and B-roll footage that I shot in the art studio with my Blackmagic Pocket Cinema Camera 4K, still images of live streams from people down at the protests, as well as news footage, and then of course final master images, high-res images of the final finished paintings themselves. So now that I have all this material, how am I going to craft it into a compelling short documentary? In many ways, a short doc is like writing a short essay. It's an economic form that needs to be clear and precise, but it also needs to convey tone and emotion and evoke feeling on a cinematic level. It's important in the very beginning to pretty quickly establish your character, the character's credibility. Why are we following this person? Why is this the person to latch onto as a character to take us on this particular journey? And then, of course, the catalytic event, the reason, the what, the why. What are we telling here? The next big part of it is to find the thematic and dramatic through line. What is the internal journey and what is the physical manifestation of the journey? In the case of this doc, the thematic through line is basically painting conflict. The dramatic through line is the process behind and the actual making of the paintings. When editing narrative or documentary, I really love to think in terms of movements, both visually and thematically. What I mean by that is essentially in the story as it progresses, a number of ideas are being explored. For each of these ideas, I like to approach those as almost their own short micro movie within a short movie. Each one of these things takes on its own tone, and that could just be as simple as what camera that you're using for that sequence, or how much you're leaning on a particular set of shots, say being down at the protest shots versus the main interview shots. You basically try to make these sequences really stand alone visually so that the audience subliminally is really feeling change and progression and are getting new approaches cinematically to these ideas as they're expressed. So in the case of this film, there ended up being 7 movements. This number is totally arbitrary, but in looking back at the structure, that's how it turned out. So what I'd like to do is basically just share with you how I utilize these movements to create unique and differentiated scenes throughout the story. The first movement is the opening setup. I establish my dad's core motivation and also introduce his art. And again, in this opening scene, I want to establish his credibility. Why is my dad uniquely qualified to tell this story, and why should we care? So this is done in the opening sequence right away. It's the first line in the film.
I grew up in Nazi-occupied Holland.
And showing his art and the influence of these early formative experiences.
So I painted like my childhood memories of the war, what it was like then as a child living under the rule of fascism.
With all of these key ideas established, then the end of this sequence propels us directly into the next movement.
So when these things happened here in Portland, I went down there and started documenting.
The second movement transitions us out of the studio and into downtown Portland. So this is basically where we establish the theme of civil rights conflict in American history.
When I came here in the mid-60s, it was just the very, very beginning of the civil rights movement.
Then the third movement reflects on the current state of civil rights conflict in America and the growing and emboldened voice of white supremacy in recent years. Here to change up the visual imagery and also just shift the overall tone, this is where I start to introduce news footage and audio.
I thought, well, those are the kind of things I painted in the past.
So the next movement, the fourth in the film, describes how my dad would nightly watch live stream videos coming from the protests, where he would photograph moments on his iPad in real time.
At night, I would follow these kids who were with their little movie sticks.
This basically prompted me to build this sequence with still kind of grainy screen grabs of these live streams. We move away from the documentary moving footage to the series of stills, and in doing that, it also gives this scene its own kind of unique visual style. The fifth movement turns to the visual backdrop of the protests, the Portland Justice Center and the federal courthouse building. The story narrows in on the buildings both architecturally, but also its symbolic potency, and especially as the buildings become transformed physically and visually by the actual events transpiring around them. So the sixth movement is the reveal. It finally introduces us to the paintings that we've been talking about. We've been bearing witness to the research that goes into them, and now finally we begin to show these paintings. This sequence makes the most radical visual leap. It takes us out of the realism of the imagery that we've been seeing, and we're now looking through this expressionistic lens of the artist at these historic events. The goal of the protagonist is complete. You know, he's reached his goal and he's made this set of paintings. That brings us to the final movement, the outro. This is the seventh movement in the film. Here we return to the art studio where we see my dad in his natural setting, painting a new canvas. So here we basically bring in the conclusion of our essay as my dad reflects on what he has witnessed and where, in his view, we might still be headed. We land the film on the final potent thought. There are, of course, a lot of ways to approach documentary narratives. For me, editing is in many ways an extension of the writing process. To get the project shot, you've found a story that you want to tell. You've done the research and crafted interview questions to capture the story. And ultimately, once the filming is finished, the story really resides now in the material you have. It resides in the footage, in the images. So your job is to pull that story back out, pull it out of those materials, sculpt and construct it from this new material, and find ways in which to keep the scenes progressing and building. It's an exciting process, and it's one that I love because there's always unexpected discoveries at every stage. So what do you think about the idea of mapping out a short documentary story in movements? Let me know in the comments. This particular video was a broad view of the creative story approach to creating a short documentary video. Next, I'll be getting into more specific steps, taking you from the beginning of the editing process all the way through to output and delivery. Check out how I shot the interview and the B-roll in this video here, and then take a deeper dive into the step-by-step process of editing a documentary video right here.